Is China mulling a quarantine against Taiwan? Part 1. How a quarantine can be used and its advantages. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, under the control of President Xi Jinping, has stepped up its rhetoric over reuniting with Taiwan as a matter of not if, but when. In pursuit of this policy, the CCP has intensified its naval, air, and missile exercises to simulate a military takeover of the island. The Chinese are clearly building up for a military capability to overtake the island, but they also know that a military takeover of the island would most likely lead to a war with the United States and Japan. The CCP leadership understands the danger of such a war, and there is now concern that they might be exploring an alternative option in the Taiwan Straits that could avoid war and be challenging for the world to react to it. China has put a determined effort and spent a significant portion of its GDP to improve the capability of the People's Liberation Army, or PLA. An increase in aggressive rhetoric towards Taiwan has accompanied the increased capability of the PLA. The PLA exercises in the Taiwan Straits have demonstrated a level of realism and are conducted with increased aggression and occurrences and are performed with a blatant disregard of Taiwan's sovereignty. Taiwan's sovereignty is not a concern for China, as the idea of Taiwan's sovereignty would be contrary to their One China policy. The CCP's One China policy asserts that the People's Republic of China, or PRC, is the sole government of China. The United States recognized this as part of an agreement between the two countries in 1979. The PRC demanded that this One China policy include the PRC's sovereignty over the Republic of China, or Taiwan. The United States did not agree to this demand from China, but it did not mean that CCP gave up on its view of Taiwan's status, despite the fact that the United States does not recognize China's version. Over the decades, China has grown stronger and more aggressive on the world stage, and it now wants to impose its One China policy on the world. China attempts to force any government that wants to establish diplomatic relations, enter into any type of agreement, or be part of the Belt and Road Initiative to accept China's version of the One China policy, with Ukraine being the latest country to submit to China's demands. China's aggressiveness and threats towards Taiwan have been alarming to the international community, leading to countries trying to de-escalate the situation. China quickly accuses and threatens any country that challenges China's Taiwan policy or seeks to resolve the issue with the Chinese government, claiming that they are trying to meddle in China's internal affairs. This is due to China's interpretation of the One China policy, which maintains that Taiwan is an integral part of China and should be considered an internal matter rather than a global issue. Most countries tend to back down or refrain from addressing the issue indirectly in order to avoid facing the CCP's wrath and accusations. China creates a manufactured crisis to assert that it already resolved the Taiwan issue and handles the final resolution as an internal matter. The issue is that Taiwan is a significant partner in international trade and is a world leader in advanced chip manufacturing and advanced semiconductor manufacturing, which thus makes it influential in international trade. It, for all intents and purposes, it acts as a country. Therefore, the international community cannot simply accept China's claims. The CCP leadership is aware of its significant military capabilities, and it also is conscious of its military's inexperience. A military operation across the Taiwan Straits would be complex, especially considering that it would require combat with both the United States and Japan, a task that may be beyond the PLA's capabilities and experience. The CCP also did not envision the PLA as a peer to the United States for at least a decade, and most likely not until 2045. The United States and its allies are now concerned that China, aware of its potential limitations, may be seeking a non-kinetic alternative in adopting its tendency towards gray zone tactics to accomplish the goals without firing a shot and create a true fait accompli over Taiwan. A gray zone tactic is confrontation that uses non-military means to achieve a political objective. The gray zone is a reference to the gray area between war and peace. China has the option to invade or blockade Taiwan instead of opting to impose a quarantine on the island, a move that would greatly concern the U.S. due to the potential inability to effectively respond to the operation. The quarantine would be a law enforcement activity to control the flow of air and maritime traffic into and out of Taiwan. The implementation would allow food and medical supplies to remain on the island while severely restricting all other trade and travel. The PLA would lead the operation. The PLA would not lead the operation. It would only provide support. This is because if the PLA were to lead the operation, it would be viewed as a blockade requiring a military response. The organization to lead the operation would be the Chinese Coast Guard, which has more ships than any other Coast Guard in the world, and would lead the operation. The PLA and the Chinese Maritime Militia would support the Coast Guard by reporting air and sea traffic and, on occasion, attempting to interdict shipping. The quarantine could also be effective due to Taiwan's unique hybrid status. To appease China, the majority of the world refuses to recognize Taiwan as a fully fledged country, even if they do not accept China's version of the One China policy. This implies that the international decision not to grant Taiwan national status can justify the fact that it is a law enforcement activity through a stretch of logic on the Chinese side. What is it if most of the world doesn't consider it a nation, and what's the international law on acting against a gray zone or a country that is in the gray zone? Decades of international timidity towards Taiwan have resulted in a situation where an ironclad challenge to a violation of Taiwan's sovereignty from a quarantine is not possible. This gray zone and these gaps in status allows the CCP to find a way to justify the idea of a quarantine and justify it no matter how much it stretches the law. A quarantine gives 4 distinct advantages according to the CSIS. The first, this allows China to assert its sovereignty over Taiwan, thereby imposing greater political and administrative control over the territory. Thus, China can claim that Taiwan cannot self-govern because it does not control its own sovereignty. This argument is self-fulfilling as China establishes conditions to interfere with Taiwan's sovereignty and then asserts that Taiwan's lacks sovereignty due to its inability to effectively counter China's actions. Because Taiwan's Coast Guard is significantly smaller than Chinese Coast Guard, preventing this would be difficult. Second, the CCP can use quarantine to interfere with Taiwan's domestic politics. A quarantine would severely restrict trade on the island and cause an economic crisis. The economic crisis would weaken the support and the pro-independent parties and allow pro-China parties in Taiwan to rise in popularity, allowing the CCP to exert more influence over the island's affairs. As previously mentioned, the Coast Guard would lead the quarantine, with the PLA playing a supporting role. This would give the quarantine the appearance of being a law enforcement and administrative action, not a military one. With fewer vessels, the Taiwanese Coast Guard would face overwhelming force from the Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime Militia to enforce its own laws. The fourth is that even without full implementation around the entire island, a quarantine can have a significant impact and doesn't require full-time maintenance of the quarantine. Intermittent enforcement may prompt airline companies to modify their routes to avoid Taiwan, as they did when China unilaterally changed the ADIZ location and airlines simply complied. Additionally, ocean-going cargo carriers may be subject to new CCP rules by entering Taiwan ports due to the Chinese implementation of its market power in product exports. These carriers may not want to lose this source of business or risk facing fines and other sanctions from China. A quarantine is so effective because it is difficult to counter. The use of military force would be difficult to justify if the CCP was not using military force to cut the island off and was still allowing the flow of humanitarian aid to the island to freely flow through. Gray zone tactics are difficult for state actors to counter, and this would be no different. The windfall of a successful quarantine would be immense for the CCP. The PLA would be unscathed, eliminating the possibility of a social backlash due to high casualties or a military loss. Not only would the PLA be unscathed, but its control over Taiwan would allow it to break into the first island chain. This would allow it to project full power deeper into the Western Pacific, exert firmer control over the South China Sea, and project air power against the Philippines, and make it harder for the U.S. Navy to operate effectively around southern Japan and the Korean Peninsula. China would absorb Taiwan's financial advantages, including its advanced manufacturing as well. The next paper will discuss if there is a viable option for the U.S. and its allies to meet this potential threat.